Tonight we're stepping into the summer of 1816, into a rented villa on the edge of a dark Swiss lake, where the rain has not stopped for 3 weeks and the sun has not appeared for longer than that. We're not here for the famous story you've probably heard, the ghost story contest, the brilliant circle, the literary game that changed the world. We're here for what that story leaves out. We're here for the 18-year-old girl in the corner of the room, the one who hadn't slept, the one who had buried a baby 15 months earlier and was still dreaming about it. Hey, before we begin tonight, if the channel has been finding its way into your evenings, a subscription means it will simply keep doing that. It finds its way back to you without you having to search for it. And a like helps too, and it costs nothing. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. A house in rural Canada with the first snow of the year at the window. A flat somewhere in the north of England with the rain coming in off the moors. A room in Melbourne with the ceiling fan running and the street gone quiet below. I read every single one. There is something I've always liked about this particular audience. Scattered across different times of night, different hemispheres, different centuries of weather, all listening to the same story in the dark. If this topic surprised you when you saw it, if you had no idea how personal it was, tell me that too. Now, let your shoulders drop, let your legs go heavy, let the rain come in. Let's go back to 1816, to the villa above the lake, to the moment before the story begins. In March 1815, an 18-year-old girl wrote 7 words in her journal. She wrote, "Dreamt that my little baby came to life again." She wrote that it had only been cold, and that they rubbed it before the fire and it lived. Then she wrote, "Awake and find no baby." 15 months later, she began writing Frankenstein. The room was dark. It was the middle of June, but the sky outside had the quality of late November, low and brownish and heavy with cloud that had no intention of lifting. Lake Geneva lay below the villa, black and flat, the water barely visible through the rain on the glass. A candle burned somewhere behind her. The shutters were closed. The moonlight was struggling to get through. And between 2 and 3 in the morning, Mary Godwin, 18 years old, lying awake in the dark, saw something so vivid and so terrible that she could not look away from it even with her eyes shut. What was the dream she had about her dead baby? And why does it read like a first draft of the most famous horror novel ever written? How did a teenager who had never published a word become the founder of modern science fiction? Why was the sun missing from the sky that summer? And what did a volcano on the other side of the world have to do with it? What happened when a scientist applied electrical current to a hanged man's corpse in front of a live audience? And why did one of the officials present reportedly die of fright? Why was her own father, the man who taught her to love books, the person who hurt her most completely? How did 2 women connected to her die within weeks of each other in the autumn of that same year? And what did she do exactly 20 days after the second body was found? And why did the world spend 13 years believing that a man had written her book? The answer to all of those questions lives inside a single year. Not a famous year, not a year that appears in the history books under her name, a year that happened mostly indoors, in rented rooms, beside a lake in Switzerland, with rain on the windows and a candle burning low, while an 18-year-old girl wrote and grieved and thought about the dead. She began somewhere she could never remember, because she was there before memory started. Her mother died 11 days after she was born. That is the first sentence of her life, and it casts a shadow over everything that follows, not a metaphor, not a framing device. It is the first fact of Mary Godwin's life, and it is the fact that every other fact in her life organises itself around. Mary Wollstonecraft, philosopher, feminist, author of one of the most radical books of the 18th century, died on September the 10th, 1797, of puerperal fever, childbed fever, an infection that spread from the womb outward, that took 11 days to kill her, that left her husband William Godwin sitting in a chair outside her bedroom door unable to enter, and left her infant daughter alive in the house, small and unaware and fed by a stranger's milk. The cause of death was the birth. The birth was Mary. This is the world Mary Godwin was born into, a world that punished her mother twice, once by letting her die, and once by deciding her death made everything she'd written suspect. Godwin wrote about it. That is the kind of man he was, a philosopher who processed grief through his pen. He published a memoir of Wollstonecraft within 6 months of her death, a memoir so frank about her previous love affairs and her illegitimate first daughter that it scandalised London rather than honouring her, and largely destroyed the reputation he had intended to preserve. It was called Memoirs of the Author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. It was Godwin's attempt to make her immortal. London read it and decided she was immoral instead. The book that was supposed to be her monument became the reason her name was whispered, rather than spoken for the next century. And into this world, small and new and already responsible for someone's ending, arrived Mary. The portrait of Mary Wollstonecraft hung in Godwin's study. A painting by John Opie, a serious direct gaze, the kind of face that knows it is being looked at and does not adjust for it. Mary saw that face every day. She read her mother's books. She read A Vindication of the Rights of Woman and letters, written during a short residence in Sweden, Norway and Denmark. She read them in a house that also contained, at various points, a bustling publishing business, a complicated stepmother, 3 other children, a constant shortage of money, and the low-grade noise of a family that was always almost falling apart. A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, 5 years before its author's death, had argued something that sounded reasonable when summarized, and was, in fact, explosive when understood in its implications. It argued that women were not inherently inferior in mind or capacity, and that the apparent inferiority of women was the result of an inferior education, of being trained, from birth, to be decorative rather than functional, to be pleasing rather than capable, to value sentiment over reason. Wollstonecraft argued that this was not only wrong but actively harmful to society, because a society in which half its members were prevented from developing their full intellectual capacity was a society that had voluntarily halved its own intelligence. This was not an abstract argument. It had immediate personal implications for every woman who read it. It told its readers, directly, that the limitations they had been told were theirs, by nature were in fact impositions, that the cage was not their natural habitat, that they had been built for more than they had been allowed to become. Mary Godwin read this argument at an age when it was not yet abstract, when it was exactly as urgent and immediate as the gap between what she could understand and what she was permitted to do about it. The house was at 41 Skinner Street, in the Holborn district of London, not a fashionable address. Skinner Street sat near Smithfield Market, and Smithfield Market was where cattle were brought to be slaughtered. In summer, depending on the wind, the smell reached the street, blood and offal, and the particular heavy sweetness of animals penned too close together in heat. In winter, the mud from the market clung to boots and wheels and spread across the cobbles in a brown paste that worked its way under doors. The bookshop occupied the ground floor, M.J. Godwin and Company, juvenile library, a business that published children's books and was perpetually on the edge of ruin. The smell of the shop was different. Paper and ink and old leather and the particular dusty warmth of a room where the shelves reached the ceiling. Above the shop were the family's rooms. They were not large. They were reached by a staircase narrow enough that two people could not pass each other on it without turning sideways. Voices carried through the floor from the shop below. The creak of the stairs was something every member of the household knew by feel. Which step groaned and which was silent, which made it possible to move through the house at night without waking anyone. Godwin married again in 1801, 4 years after Wollstonecraft's death. His second wife, Mary Jane Clairmont, arrived with 2 children of her own, a son named Charles and a daughter named Jane, who would later rename herself Claire. The household at Skinner Street therefore contained at its fullest 5 children from 3 different family configurations, one famous philosopher who was always either writing or receiving visitors, one stepmother who found it difficult to love her husband's first daughter as much as her own, and almost never enough money for all of it. Mary Godwin grew up understanding from a fairly early age that she was the child who'd made everything harder by arriving. Not because anyone said so, because the shape of the household said so. Into this crowded, intellectually electric, domestically precarious house came a remarkable collection of visitors. Samuel Taylor Coleridge came, and Mary, hiding on the staircase, heard him recite the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner in the room below. She was perhaps 8 or 9 years old. The poem went on for quite a long time, as the poem does. She did not move. She listened to the whole thing from the dark of the stairs, her back against the wall, not wanting to be sent to bed. She could feel the vibration of his voice through the floorboards. The poem about the dead sailor who could not die, who moved and stared and would not lie down, entered her ears in the dark of a staircase, at an age when the dark of a staircase is its own particular country. Scientists came too. Men interested in electricity and its properties, in the phenomenon that Luigi Galvani had named and half explained. Galvanism, the discovery that an electrical current applied to the muscles of a dead creature could cause it to move. Galvani had done his experiments on frogs. His nephew, Giovanni Aldini, had taken the work considerably further. In 1803, just 6 years before Mary was old enough to understand such conversations, Aldini had conducted a public demonstration in London at the Royal College of Surgeons with an audience of scientists and officials on the body of a man named George Forster, who had been hanged at Newgate that same morning for the murder of his wife and child. Aldini applied conducting rods to Forster's jaw, to his ear, to his rectum. The jaw quivered. One eye opened, the right fist clenched, the legs moved. One of the officials present reportedly died of fright shortly afterward. This was not a rumour. This was the science of the age, conducted in a hall before witnesses, with publication to follow. The conversations in Godwin's front room touched on all of it. The question of what electricity was, what it could do, whether the line between life and death was a hard border or a permeable membrane. These conversations happened at dinner, in the lamplight, within earshot of a girl on the stairs who had already spent years thinking about the dead. There is something worth pausing on in that image. A child who grows up listening to brilliant people talk in the room below her, through the floor, through the walls, who reads every book in reach, who has no formal schooling to speak of. Godwin believed children educated themselves best through curiosity, and largely left Mary to prove or disprove this theory, and who, as a result, constructs her own education out of whatever she can reach. By the time she was 14, she had published a poem, through her father's own press. It was called Mounseer Nongtongpo. It is not, it must be said, the work she is remembered for, but it existed. At 14 she had made something that could be held. The place she went to think was a churchyard. St. Pancras Old Church stood about 1.5 miles north of Skinner Street, and in the churchyard of St. Pancras, in a grave marked by a simple headstone, lay Mary Wollstonecraft. Godwin took Mary there when she was very small. According to family tradition, and this is a detail that has been passed down and cannot be verified with complete precision, but that every biographer notes because it refuses to be omitted, he taught her to spell her name by tracing the letters carved into the stone. M-R, the letters of her mother's name, which were also the letters of her own. She went back alone. As she grew older, she would sit beside the grave and read. She read her mother's books there, in the churchyard, which is a particular kind of intimacy, reading a woman's words while sitting on the ground above that woman's bones. The grass was damp much of the year. The stone was always cold, even in summer, if she pressed her hand against it. The churchyard had a particular smell, the turned earth smell of London ground, old and dense, threaded with something that was almost botanical, as though the grave itself were slowly becoming garden. She would sit with her back against a neighbouring stone, or cross-legged on the grass, with a book open in her lap and her mother's headstone visible whenever she looked up. The world Wollstonecraft had described, the argument she had made, the life she had lived, came to Mary filtered through grief and stone and the specific quality of afternoon light that falls in an old London churchyard, low and grey and somehow concentrated, the way light behaves when the walls are high and the trees are old. What she was reading, in essence, was a letter from someone who had not known she would die, a person who had written for a future she assumed she would inhabit, and Mary sat there, the creation whose creator had not survived the act of creating, and she read. She was the answer to a question her mother never got to ask. That thought would take years to become a novel, but it was already forming down somewhere below conscious articulation in the churchyard beside the stone. Inside the Skinner Street house, meanwhile, there were 2 other girls who mattered. Fanny Imlay was the eldest, Wollstonecraft's first daughter, born from a relationship before Wollstonecraft met Godwin, a daughter whose father had eventually abandoned both of them. Fanny was 3 years older than Mary. She was gentle, careful, and constitutionally unsuited to the kind of intellectual combativeness that the Godwin household required as a baseline social skill. She was quiet. She managed things. She smoothed over conflicts between the stepmother and the children, fetched and helped and organised, and never seemed to need anything in return, or at least never said so. She was the kind of person a family leans on without quite seeing, the load-bearing wall, the one whose solidity everyone relies on and no one thinks to thank. Mary loved her. She loved her in the specific way one loves someone who has always simply been there, which is to say, without quite knowing it until much later. Claire Claremont, born Jane, renamed by herself, was something else entirely. She was Godwin's stepdaughter by his second marriage, which made her no blood relation to Mary at all, but they had grown up in the same crowded room since Claire was 3 and Mary was 4. Claire was lively, impulsive, and possessed of an absolute certainty about her own importance that the world was not always inclined to confirm. She spoke French fluently. She had opinions about everything. She and Mary were close in the way that people are close when they have shared too small a space for too long, affectionate and irritating in equal measure, bound by proximity into something that looked, from the outside like sisterhood. It was Claire who first met him. In 1812, a young man arrived at Godwin's door as a devoted admirer. Percy Bysshe Shelley was 20 years old, a published poet, the heir to a baronetcy, and an acolyte of William Godwin's philosophical work so fervent that he had written Godwin letters and Godwin had written back, which was not nothing. Godwin did not write back to everyone. Shelley was married, as it happened. He had eloped at 19 with a 16-year-old named Harriet Westbrook. But this did not prevent him from spending considerable time at the Skinner Street house over the following 2 years, debating philosophy with the father and eventually meeting the daughter. Mary was not there at first. In the summer of 1812, Godwin had sent her away to Scotland to stay with friends of his, the Baxters, in a move that was partly about getting Mary out of the difficult domestic atmosphere and partly about the kind of informal intellectual broadening he believed in. She was 15. She spent nearly a year in Scotland and then returned. She was 16 when she first properly encountered Percy Shelley. By then, he'd been coming to the house for 2 years. He knew her father well. He was unhappily married and increasingly unhappy about it. He was brilliant and reckless and entirely certain that conventional morality was a cage built by the weak to contain the strong, and he was standing in her father's bookshop talking in the way that Percy Shelley always talked, as though the conversation were the most important thing happening anywhere in the world. It would not be Skinner Street where they first spoke plainly. It would be the churchyard, the same churchyard, the same stone. The afternoon she would remember, the afternoon they walked to St. Pancras and stood beside her mother's grave and said what they had both been building toward, was in June 1814. She was 16 years old. He was 21 and legally someone else's husband. And in the shadow of a headstone that had taught her to read, in the churchyard where she had come, alone, to be close to the woman she'd never known, Mary Godwin fell in love. The grave connects everything. It was where her mother was, it was where her name was, and it was where the first chapter of her own life actually began. We will come back to that grave. Later tonight, at the very end of the story, it becomes something different. But for now, for the summer of 1814, it is where a decision was made that would change everything, and not only for the two people who made it. The decision was this: on the night of July 28, 1814, 3 people left London with almost no money and no plan beyond getting to the coast. Mary Godwin was 16 years old. Percy Bysshe Shelley was 21. Claire Claremont was 16. They took a hired carriage to the Dover Road, travelled through the night, and reached the Channel port in the early morning. They had packed in a hurry. Mary had a small bag. Percy had his notebooks. What they did not have was the blessing of anyone who knew them, the funds to sustain themselves past the first few weeks, or any particular sense of what they would do when they got to the other side. What they did have was Percy's absolute conviction that what they were doing was right. This is worth examining for a moment, because it is easy to romanticize and important not to. Percy Bysshe Shelley was, by any conventional measure, a married man abandoning his wife. Harriet Shelley, born Harriet Westbrook, was 19 years old. She'd eloped with Percy when she was 16 and he was 18, against her family's wishes. She had given him a daughter, Ianthe, born in June 1813, and she was pregnant again at the time Percy fell in love with Mary Godwin. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply married a man who had decided by the summer of 1814 that conventional marriage was a philosophical position he no longer held. Percy believed, sincerely, thoroughly, in the way that brilliant young men sometimes believe things that are convenient for them to believe. That love could not be bounded by legal contracts, and that true freedom required the courage to live outside the rules that enslaved ordinary people. He had read William Godwin's early philosophical works on the subject. He was, in fact, an admirer of the father whose daughter he was now removing from the family home without the father's knowledge or consent. Godwin, when he found out, was furious in a way that his own published philosophy made difficult to justify. Here was a man who had spent his career arguing that marriage was an irrational institution, a property arrangement dressed up in sentiment, that true minds could not be bound by it. Here was that same man writing letters of furious condemnation because his 16-year-old daughter had acted on those principles with a married man. The gap between the philosophical Godwin and the paternal Godwin was not small. He banned Percy from the house. He refused to communicate with Mary directly. He called the affair, in a phrase that has been remembered precisely because of its breathtaking hypocrisy, a system of fraud. He would not speak to his daughter for 2.5 years. The Channel crossing was rough. The boat was small, the seas were heavy, and what was supposed to take a few hours became an overnight ordeal. Mary was seasick. The wind was contrary. Claire, who had come partly because she spoke French and partly because she could not bear to be left behind, was also sick. Percy, characteristically, was not sick at all, and spent the crossing in a state of high philosophical excitement about freedom and the open sea, which was probably not easy to be near in those conditions. They arrived in Calais in the grey early morning. France smelled of salt and mud and horses and unfamiliar things. They slept in beds that were not their own, in a room above a street that spoke a language Claire handled and the other two could not, and then they began to move. The road south from Calais was white with chalk dust in the August heat. The landscape flattened through the farmland of the Pas de Calais, and then began gradually to change as they moved further south. The fields wider, the towns smaller, the sky different in a way that Mary noted in her journal, and tried to explain and could not entirely. She had never been outside England. Everything was evidence. The bread was different. The light was different. The quality of the silence in the middle of a French field at midday was different. A heavier silence than an English one, warmer, more inhabited. She wrote all of it down. She was 16 years old, and she was taking notes on her own life, with the diligence of someone who understood instinctively that the writing would outlast the experience, south and east, through villages and towns whose names Mary wrote down in her journal, with the careful precision of someone who is not sure when she will be home again and wants to remember everything. The journal is meticulous in a way that is both touching and quietly startling. This is a girl on the run, broke, in a foreign country, nursing a seasick aftermath, and she is taking notes. Date, location, weather, observation. The habit of a writer so deep it operated even when nothing else did. They could not afford the post-chaise, which was the standard mode of transport for people who wished to travel across France without their feet giving out. They walked, in the summer heat of a French August, on roads that were not paved to any modern standard, and were covered in a fine pale dust that worked its way into everything. Boots, bags, hair, the pages of journals. They walked. Mary's feet blistered. The blisters burst and reformed. They ate bread and whatever they could find at market stalls, and the bread was different from English bread in ways that were interesting when they were not hungry and irrelevant when they were. They hired a donkey at one point. One donkey. For 3 people. Percy Bysshe Shelley had written letters to the thinkers as radicals of his age. He had corresponded with William Godwin as an intellectual equal. He had published poetry and considered himself a figure of some significance in the unfolding story of English Romanticism. The English Romantic movement produced a great deal of writing about freedom and the open road and the sublime individual casting off society's chains. The donkey was not large. Percy sat on it and read, which is the most Percy Bysshe Shelley thing it is possible to do, and Mary and Claire walked beside him in the dust. This is the contrast that this story refuses to let go of. On one side, the grand pronouncements, love unbounded, freedom absolute, the radical life. On the other side, blistered feet on a French road, a borrowed donkey, and a 16-year-old girl writing in her journal at the end of the day, with the diligence of someone who knows that if she does not write it down, the only record of her existence will be what other people choose to remember. She was already keeping her own archive. She was already doing the thing that would matter most, which was not the elopement and not the philosophy and not the brilliant conversation. It was the writing. Percy's health was also unreliable. He had a tendency toward dramatic physical collapses, chest pains, mysterious fevers, exhaustions that descended suddenly and required bed rest, and the exertion of the journey brought some of these on. Mary nursed him in cheap inns. She wrote in her journal in the evenings. She was 16 years old, in love, in a foreign country, with no money and no social standing and no safety net of any kind, and she was paying attention. The route took them into Switzerland, and Mary felt the Alps for the first time, the scale of them, the way they refused the sky. She had grown up in London, in cramped rooms above the failing bookshop, with Smithfield Market around the corner and the horizon permanently interrupted by buildings. The mountains were something else entirely. They moved through the valleys in the mornings when the light was low and golden, and the mist was still in the upper reaches, and the silence was a different kind of silence than Mary had known. Not the silence of a room where no one was talking, but the silence of something enormous that did not need to speak. She felt small in a way that was not unpleasant. She wrote about the mountains in her journal. She wrote about the way the light moved on the glaciers in the afternoon, turning blue and then almost violet at the edges. She was 16. She was also, already, the writer she would spend the rest of her life becoming. They were in Switzerland, at the foot of the Alps, when the money ran out entirely. Percy had expected funds to arrive from England. They did not arrive, because the people who were supposed to send them had decided, reasonably enough, that funding the flight of a married man with 2 young girls was not something they wished to be involved in. The group turned around. They came back through Germany and into Holland, and took a boat from Rotterdam to Gravesend, and arrived in England in September 1814 with nothing. They were gone 6 weeks. Mary later co-wrote the account of the journey, published years afterward as History of a 6 Weeks Tour. It is a quietly extraordinary document, a travelogue written by someone who was simultaneously living through the most destabilizing period of her life, and cataloguing it with the discipline of a writer who already understood that everything that happened to her was material. London received them exactly as London might have been expected to receive them. They arrived at Gravesend and came into the city in September, and the city looked exactly as it had when they left it, grey and practical and entirely uninterested in their philosophical experiment. The streets were the same. The smell of Smithfield reached Skinner Street the same as always. But the people were different. The doors were different. The eyes that watched them on the street had a specific quality that Mary would learn to recognize over the following months. Not hostility exactly. Something more efficient. The careful absence of acknowledgement. The social equivalent of a door closed quietly but firmly before you could get a hand inside. Godwin would not see Mary. Harriet Shelley, Percy's legal wife, was somewhere in the city, pregnant with their second child, and Percy had written her letters from France, explaining that his love for Mary Godwin did not diminish his affection for Harriet, a letter that was, to put it gently, not well received. Percy's family was appalled. Mary's stepmother was appalled. Their circle of acquaintance contracted sharply, as circles do when the people at their centre have done something the circle prefers not to be associated with. Most people, when they imagine the romantic elopement, the flight across the Channel, the continental journey, the radical love, imagine something that looked like freedom. The reality was a series of damp rented rooms, creditors' letters, and a social world that had quietly agreed to pretend they did not exist. The man who carried himself as though the conversation were always the most important thing in the room was now making his beloved's life considerably smaller. The English Romantic movement produced no shortage of men who believed in freedom for themselves and delivered restriction to the women who loved them. Percy was not unusual in this. He was simply the one Mary had chosen. And yet she was not sorry. She said so, and the journals record it, and the letters record it, and every account of this period confirms that Mary Godwin in the autumn of 1814 was, despite the poverty and the ostracism and her father's silence, not a person who believed she had made a mistake. She was someone who had chosen, at 16, to live by the principles her mother had died before she could enact, and her father had preached without practicing. The irony of that was not lost on her. It was, in fact, exactly the kind of irony she would spend her life turning over. Percy talked about freedom as a philosophy. Mary was discovering what freedom actually cost when you were a woman and 16 and had no independent income, and the social world had decided to close its doors. The cost, in practical terms, was considerable. They lived in rented rooms that they could barely afford, moving frequently when the rent became too much. Percy spent a great deal of time managing his increasingly complicated financial and legal situation. Mary spent a great deal of time pregnant. Their first child, a daughter, born prematurely in February 1815, came into a household that was cold and unstable and short of everything. That child will be the whole of the next chapter. But before we arrive there, it is worth staying with Harriet Shelley for a moment, because Harriet is the woman this story tends to move past quickly, and she deserves a sentence or two. Harriet Westbrook was 19, then 20, then 21, living in London with two young children, Ianthe and then Charles, born in November 1814, while her husband lived openly with another woman and sent her letters about the philosophical nature of love. She was not wealthy. She was not protected. She had no Godwin to have educated her, no mother's portrait on the wall, no inherited vocabulary for thinking about what was happening to her. She'd been told, at 16, that she was too sensitive and too intelligent for the life her family offered. She had believed it. She had acted on it. And now she was a single mother in a city that did not look kindly on women in her situation, corresponding with a husband who explained, in elegant and well-constructed sentences, why loving someone else was not a betrayal of her. The distance between Percy's ideas about freedom and the physical reality of Harriet's life in those rooms was not a small distance. It was the entire argument. We will come back to Harriet. She has a place later in this story, a place so dark that it silenced rooms when the news came. But that is December 1816, and we are not there yet. For now it is the autumn of 1814, and Mary Godwin is 17, and the man she eloped with has cost her almost everything she had. Her father's voice, her social world, her safety. And she has decided this is still better than the alternative. She's living by her mother's principles in a world her mother did not survive long enough to inhabit. The man she loves is, at this point in the story, a living person. He carries his notebooks everywhere. He is never not talking. He is the kind of person who makes everyone around him feel that the present moment is the most electric one that has ever existed. She does not know, cannot know, that one day the thing she will value most of him is something small enough to carry in a silk cloth tucked inside the pages of a poem. But that is a long way from here. First, the winter of 1814. First, a premature birth. First, a dream. That long way began immediately. The silk cloth and the notebook and Percy alive. Those were still in the future. What arrived first was the winter. The baby was born in February 1815, 2 months early. She had no name recorded in the journals, or rather, no name that has survived clearly in the records. She was small. She was born into a household that was cold because the rooms were cold, not because anyone wanted them that way. And she was born into the arms of a 17-year-old mother who'd been living in exile from her father for 7 months, who had no female relatives nearby, who was not well herself. The labour had been difficult. The infant was tiny, the way premature infants are tiny, not in a way that is cute or manageable, but in a way that makes the people around them hold very still and speak quietly, as though a loud noise might be sufficient to unsettle the whole fragile arrangement. The baby lived for 11 days. She died most likely of convulsions, the fragile systems of a premature infant, assembled 2 months before they were ready, giving out. Mary checked on her one morning and found her cold. She wrote about it to a friend. The letter is matter-of-fact in the way that people write when they are trying to hold themselves together by remaining very specific about facts. She described what she'd found. She did not describe what it felt like to find it. The journal is different. Mary kept a journal throughout this period, and the journal is the document of the unmaintained self, the place where she was not performing composure for anyone. On February 27th, she wrote, "Find my baby dead." On March 19th, 16 days after that, she wrote the entry that every biographer quotes because it cannot be paraphrased without losing something essential. She wrote, "Dreamt that my little baby came to life again." She wrote that it had only been cold and that they rubbed it before the fire and it lived. She wrote, "Awake and find no baby." Then she wrote, "I think about the little thing all day." That is the entry in its entirety. That is Frankenstein before Frankenstein existed. The dream of rubbing a cold body by a fire until it came back. The warmth that was supposed to work. The spark that was supposed to cross from the living world back into the dead one, and did not. She was 17 years old. She had no mother, an estranged father, a partner who was frequently absent and financially chaotic, no social support, no women friends nearby, and she was writing in a journal about a dream in which her dead baby lived. It is worth saying plainly what grief at that age looks like in those circumstances. It looks like getting up and doing the things that need to be done, because there is no alternative. It looks like writing. It looks like not writing. It looks like the specific hollowness of a set of rooms that contained a small person for 11 days and now does not. The weight of a blanket that was used, and is now washed and folded. The silence where a particular kind of small noise used to be. The body's confusion, the milk that still came, for a body that did not know the purpose of the milk was gone. Mary knew that pressure from the inside. She had, in the most literal biographical sense, been the infant whose creation cost the creator her life. Whether or not this shaped the novel consciously, scholars have consistently connected those lived facts to the creature's specific grief, the bewilderment of a being that did not choose its existence and cannot understand why it was abandoned. There is something almost unbearable in that connection, if a person stops to let it land. The winter and spring of 1815 were hard in the specific way that winters are hard when grief is present and there is nowhere to put it. Percy was often away. His legal and financial situation was a constant emergency. Creditors, legal proceedings connected to his first marriage, his own complicated expectations about an inheritance that had not yet arrived. He moved through the crisis the way brilliant, charismatic people sometimes move through crises they have partly created, at speed, with energy, generating explanations and plans and optimistic projections, all of which required Mary to wait in the rooms they rented and to keep the household together with whatever remained. The rooms were always on the verge of being repossessed. Mary learned to assess a landlord's expression within the first 30 seconds of a conversation. She learned the particular bureaucratic language of debt. She learned how to move quickly when it was time to move. She was 17, then 18. These are not the skills a person expects to develop at that age. But then she was not living the life a person expects at that age. She wrote. Whatever else was happening, she wrote. The journal continued. She read everything in reach. Her father's works, her mother's works, the works of the people who came to visit, the scientific texts and philosophical arguments and travel accounts that Percy brought home in moments of financial recklessness. She was, in the absolute darkness of that period, educating herself, not for any particular purpose, simply because the alternative was to stop. She was pregnant again by the spring of 1815, a second child, conceived within weeks of losing the first, which was both biologically expected and emotionally vertiginous. A second life, beginning while the grief of the first was still entirely fresh. The physical reality of a second pregnancy after a premature birth and an infant death is not something the biographical accounts dwell on, but it is not nothing. The body that had just been through one difficult labour was being asked to carry again immediately. The household that had just been through the cold and the silence of 11 days was being arranged around a new presence in a new condition. Mary was 17 years old. She had been pregnant, delivered a premature child, watched that child die, and was pregnant again, all within a period of about 14 months, in rented rooms with insufficient heat, and a partner who was frequently elsewhere, and a father who still would not write to her directly. Percy, during this period, was often not present in the physical room. He was managing from a distance the legal consequences of his elopement, the negotiations with creditors, the correspondence with his father's solicitors about the inheritance he expected and had not yet received, the ongoing practical fallout of his still technically active first marriage. He moved between temporary addresses in London and the rooms they shared, and when he was absent the rooms were simply absent him, which was a different kind of empty from the empty the baby had left, but an empty nonetheless. Mary wrote to him during his absences. The letters are practical and warm, and give very little away about the grief underneath, which is consistent with everything else she wrote in the public register during this period. She was reading, in the months after the baby's death, with the specific urgency of someone who has no other way to leave the room they are in. She read through her father's library in her head. She had it largely memorized from years of access to it. She read Goethe, The Sorrows of Young Werther, which she'd read before, she read again in the spring of 1815, and the novel's specific texture, a narrator who cannot survive the distance between what he feels and what the world offers him, had a different weight in a rented room in February than it had had anywhere else. She was not drawing on these books consciously for a future novel. She was reading the way a person reads when the alternative is to think about what is no longer in the next room. Their son William was born in January 1816. He was healthy. He was named for William Godwin, which was either an act of extraordinary generosity toward a man who had not spoken to Mary for nearly 2 years, or an act of quiet, pointed complexity, or both. The child's health was a relief of a kind that is difficult to describe from the outside, the specific relief of a healthy infant in arms that have already held one that was not. Mary was 18. She'd been a mother twice. She had buried a child in the 11 months since she first became one. That thought was not fully conscious. She was not sitting in a rented room in early 1816 thinking, "Here is the thesis of my novel." She was nursing a baby, managing a household on uncertain funds, writing in a journal, reading everything she could find. But something was forming. Something was being assembled from all of it. The dead mother who had not survived the act of creating. The living father who had turned away rather than face what his principles demanded. The infant who had died before anyone decided what to call her. The dream of rubbing a cold body by a fire and the warmth that did not work. The question of whether electricity could bring a dead thing back to life. The specific anguish of loving something you could not keep. It was all going into a vessel she did not know she was building. What was being assembled was a story. She just did not know it yet. She would not know it until the following summer, in a villa above a dark lake, when the cold came back. Not the cold of a London winter, but something older and stranger. A cold that had travelled 12,000 miles from the other side of the world and had been circling the globe for months, changing the colour of the sky. And about that, about where the cold came from, most accounts of Mary Shelley's story do not spend enough time, because what happened to the sky in the summer of 1816 was not weather. It was a geological event on a scale that had no precedent in living memory. And it began not in Switzerland, not in England, not in any of the places this story has been so far. It began in Indonesia. With a sound that people 1,000 miles away thought was artillery fire, with an explosion so large that the ash reached the stratosphere, the upper atmosphere, above the weather where nothing usually disturbs it, and began to circle the globe in the jet stream. In April 1815, while Mary Godwin was still dreaming about her dead baby coming back to life beside a fire, Mount Tambora on the island of Sumbawa erupted. It was the most powerful volcanic eruption in recorded history. In the immediate event, it killed somewhere between 70,000 and 90,000 people. In the pyroclastic flows, in the tsunamis that followed, in the famine that came after as the ash destroyed the crops of the entire region. The mountain itself lost more than 4,000 feet of height. The caldera that remained was 6 miles wide. Mount Tambora killed between 70 and 90,000 people directly. The famine and disease that followed, as the ash destroyed crops from Indonesia to Ireland, killed more. Estimates of the total death toll from the eruption and its aftermath run as high as 200,000. This was one of the largest mass death events in the 19th century, and it is almost entirely absent from popular historical memory because it happened in a part of the world that Western historical accounts were not paying close attention to, and because its most visible effect, the ruined harvests, the strange summer, the persistent grey twilight, happened thousands of miles away, in places that recorded it as unusual weather rather than as a consequence of a specific cause. The connection between Tambora and the year without a summer was not established until the 20th century. At the time, nobody knew. The ash cloud rose into the upper atmosphere and stayed there. It spread. By the summer of 1816, it had thinned enough to be invisible to the naked eye, but dense enough to filter the sunlight before it reached the ground. The temperature across the northern hemisphere dropped by nearly 4 degrees Celsius. In some parts of Europe it dropped further than that. This summer did not come. The harvest failed. Across Switzerland, Germany, France and England, people who had planted crops watched them freeze in June. In some regions the snow fell in July and did not melt. The human consequences of this, tracked region by region, were not small. In Ireland, the potato harvest failed catastrophically. A country that had been subsisting on that single crop found itself in the early stages of the kind of food crisis that, in another 30 years, would be called the famine, though this 1816 precursor has no comparable name, because the Irish suffering of 1816 was recorded mainly in the administrative notes of people who were not Irish. In Germany and France, the failure of the grain harvest produced bread riots in the autumn, people breaking into grain stores, blocking the roads along which food was being exported, doing the things people do when the arithmetic of survival stops adding up. In New England, the summer of 1816 was called 1800 and froze to death. Frost killed the crops in June and again in August. Farmers in Vermont who had planted in hope dug out what remained in November and found it had not grown. Some families left their farms that autumn and did not return. The westward migration of American settlement accelerated that decade partly because the farms of New England had stopped being reliable. And there was something else, something quieter and stranger that happened to the light that summer. The Tambora ash in the upper atmosphere scattered the shorter wavelengths of sunlight differently than ordinary air. The result was that the sunsets of 1816 and 1817 were unusual in a way that observers across Europe and North America noted in diaries and letters. Reds and oranges and yellows of an intensity that clear air does not normally produce, lasting long after the sun had dropped below the horizon. J.M.W. Turner, the English painter who was working throughout this period, produced a series of landscapes in which the sky has an almost violent luminosity, golds and crimsons that art historians later connected when the Tambora research came in to the specific optical conditions the ash cloud created. Turner did not know what he was painting. He was painting what he saw. What he saw was a sky that a volcano had made. Mary Godwin, in early 1816, did not know any of this. Nobody did. The connection between a volcanic eruption in the Pacific and the colour of the sky in Geneva was not a connection anyone had made, because the science to make it did not yet exist. But the darkness was coming, and it was not metaphorical. The darkness arrived in May 1816, and it arrived looking exactly like ordinary weather. It looked like cloud cover that did not lift. It looked like a temperature that stayed low when it should have been rising. It looked like rain. Not dramatic biblical rain, not the kind that makes for good historical narrative. Just rain, day after day, grey-brown sky, cold mornings in what should have been early summer warmth, farmer across northern Europe looked at their fields and calculated, because farmers always calculate, and the calculations were bad. The wheat was not growing at the rate it needed to. The growing season was contracting. The cold that should have left by April was still present in June, and the people who paid closest attention to such things were already afraid. Mary Godwin was not a farmer. She was 18, she had a healthy infant son, and she was going to Switzerland because Claire Clairmont had decided they were going to Switzerland. This is the part of the story that is usually presented as a spontaneous act of romantic adventure. It was not exactly that. Claire, Mary's stepsister, had spent the spring of 1816 in London pursuing Lord Byron. George Gordon Byron, the 6th Baron Byron, was at that point the most famous poet in England and possibly in Europe, a man who had become a celebrity in a way the word celebrity had not yet been invented to describe. He was also famously dangerous to women in the way that very beautiful and entirely self-absorbed people sometimes are, and Claire had fallen into his orbit in the way that people fall into orbits, fast and without quite meaning to. By April, she was pregnant with his child. Byron, for his part, was leaving England. He had made enough enemies and caused enough scandal that England had decided it was finished with him. He was going to the continent, and he did not, particularly, want Claire to follow him. Claire arranged for Mary and Percy to come to Switzerland because Byron was going to Switzerland, and because Claire calculated correctly that Byron was unlikely to refuse to see Percy Shelley. Byron liked Percy. Percy was brilliant and serious and did not bore him. The two men would want to talk, and if they were talking, Claire would be present. This was the logic. It was not a bad logic. It simply involved two other people as tools in a plan that was primarily about Claire, which was a dynamic Mary was familiar with from a lifetime of sharing rooms with Claire Clairmont. They arrived at the Lake of Geneva in late May. They rented rooms first in a hotel at Secheron, across the lake from Geneva, and then, partly because it was cheaper and partly because Percy and Byron had begun a series of evenings that were becoming difficult to interrupt, they moved to the Maison Chapuis, a small house near Montalert on the south shore of the lake. Byron himself had taken the Villa Diodati, a large and somewhat grand stone house that stood on a slope above them, with a terrace that faced the water. On clear days, which were not frequent, the view from that terrace was extraordinary. The lake below, the Alps across it, Mont Blanc visible in the distance like a suggestion of a larger world. In June 1816, the days were rarely clear. The rain was constant. It came from a sky that was the wrong colour, not the bright grey of ordinary overcast, but something heavier and more permanent, a brownish grey that did not break and did not resolve into sunlight. Travellers who passed through Switzerland that summer described it in letters as oppressive, in a way they could not quite explain. Not merely inconvenient, but disorienting, as though the world had rearranged its rules while nobody was paying attention. The University of Bern's meteorological records, examined by climate researchers in the 20th century, show that precipitation in the region increased by roughly 80% compared to historical averages. The temperature was nearly 4 degrees Celsius below normal, which does not sound like very much until you consider that it is the difference between a field of wheat that can be harvested and a field of wheat that cannot. Inside the Villa Diodati, damp worked its way into everything. The stone walls were old and thick and cold to the touch, even on days when the fireplaces were lit. Firewood had to be brought up from below and was never quite dry. Candles burned low early in the evenings because the rooms were dark by mid-afternoon. The windows faced the lake, and the lake was most often invisible. A grey wash behind glass, the far shore gone, the mountains beyond it entirely absent. The 5 people in and around the villa moved between their rooms and the main salon in a pattern that was becoming, by June, something between a social gathering and a kind of mutual captivity. The roads near the villa were difficult that summer, and the people on them were not tourists. The harvest failures that the Tambora ash had caused across the northern hemisphere were already producing displacement. Refugees moved along the roads, farming families who'd lost everything, people from the surrounding villages and from further away, moving because staying had become impossible. The reports from the period are matter-of-fact about it. People were hungry. The price of grain was rising. The social order that agriculture sustained was under pressure in ways that would not become a formal historical crisis for another year, but were already legible to anyone who looked at the roads. Mount Tambora's eruption had killed upward of 200,000 people and displaced the harvests of an entire hemisphere. 5 miles up the slope from one of the main roads into Geneva, 5 people were trapped indoors with a candle and a conversation about ghost stories. This is, historically speaking, not an unusual arrangement. Great art is frequently made in rooms that are unaware of the scale of what is happening outside them, but it is worth keeping the roads in view. Byron was 28, brilliant, and bored in the particular way that people are bored when nothing in the world can quite match the intensity of their own mind. Percy Shelley was 23 and full of ideas that he was developing at speed, ideas about liberty and creation and the nature of the universe, and Byron was the only person he had met who could keep up with him at full pace. The conversations between them went on for hours. They walked when the weather permitted and talked when it did not, which meant they talked constantly. Polidori, John William Polidori, 20 years old, Byron's personal physician, hired for the continental tour, sat at the edges of these conversations and nursed his resentment with the diligence of a man who was smarter than he was being treated. He was, in fact, smart. He had graduated from the University of Edinburgh Medical School at 19, which was an unusual achievement even by the standards of an era when standards were irregular. He had also written a play which nobody had wanted to publish. He was keeping a diary of the tour that Byron had commissioned, which meant he was being paid to record conversations in which he was not a full participant, which is a particular kind of indignity. His feelings about Byron were complicated in the way that the feelings of everyone who spent extended time with Byron were complicated. Admiration, irritation, dependency, and a desire, not always suppressed, to be somewhere else entirely. Claire was trying to maintain Byron's attention, which was like trying to hold water in a cupped hand. Possible for a moment, impossible indefinitely. She was pregnant and had not yet told him, and Mary sat. This is the image that is most accurate and most overlooked. Mary Godwin, at this gathering of famous and almost famous men, sat and listened and thought. She was the youngest person in the room by a meaningful margin, when she was in the room at all. She was a woman, which meant that the conversations did not always pause to include her. She was also the only person present who had, within the last year, buried a child. The only person who had spent the previous 18 months living on the edge of social ruin in rented rooms with no money and no family support. The only person for whom the questions being discussed, the nature of life, the ethics of creation, the horror of abandonment, were not philosophical abstractions but the literal events of her own recent past. She was quiet in the way that very intelligent people are sometimes quiet when they are processing rather than performing. She watched. She noted. She had her journal. She had the habit, established in childhood on the stairs of a house full of brilliant visitors, of listening to everything and saying less than she understood. They read together in the evenings, when the rain made outdoor movement pointless. Byron had brought books. books. Someone in the group, accounts differ on exactly who, had obtained a collection of German ghost stories translated into French, published under the title Phantasmagoriana. They read aloud from it. The stories were atmospheric in the way that Gothic fiction is atmospheric. Dark rooms, animated corpses, spectral visitations, the unresolved dread of things that should be dead and are not. Mary listened. She'd been listening to things in dark rooms since she was a child on the staircase in Skinner Street, and she had the same habit she'd always had, which was to take what she heard and hold it and turn it. The conversations moved, as conversations in that company always moved, toward ideas, toward philosophy, toward the questions that were exciting the scientific world of the early 19th century. Questions about the nature of life, about what distinguished a living body from a dead one, about what electricity was and what it could do. Percy and Byron had both read about Galvanism. The specific evening when the conversation became most intense is difficult to date precisely, but the accounts all describe the same sequence. The room was firelit. Outside, the rain on the shutters, the lake invisible, candles on the table. Someone, likely Percy, raised the question of whether the experiments of Galvani and Aldini pointed towards something fundamental about the nature of life, whether the spark of electricity and the spark of life were the same kind of thing, whether, if that were true, the reverse engineering of life from its raw components was a philosophical question or a practical one. Byron engaged with this the way Byron engaged with ideas that interested him, directly, at speed, without any particular concern for where the conversation was going. Percy pushed further. The question of reanimation was not, by 1816, a fringe speculation. It was the edge of serious scientific inquiry. Mary listened. She had heard these conversations before, or conversations like them, in the front room at Skinner Street, filtering up through the floorboards to a child sitting very still on a staircase in the dark. They had a different weight now. She was 18. She had held a dead baby. She had dreamed of rubbing a cold body by a fire. She had spent a year and a half thinking, without quite knowing she was thinking it, about the question of what a creator owes to the thing they make. They had read about Luigi Galvani's experiments on frogs, the frog legs suspended by copper hooks from an iron railing, the way the legs convulsed when the different metals made contact. They had read about Giovanni Aldini, Galvani's nephew, who had taken the work further. In 1803, at the Royal College of Surgeons in London, Aldini had conducted a demonstration on the body of a man named George Forster, who had been hanged at Newgate Prison that morning for the murder of his wife and child. The body was brought from the execution to the hall. Aldini applied conducting rods, connected to a voltaic pile, the early battery technology of the period, to Forster's jaw, to his ear, to his fist. The jaw quivered. One eye opened. The right fist rose and clenched. The legs moved. One of the officials present reportedly died of fright in the hours that followed, though whether this was from the demonstration itself or from an unrelated cause was disputed at the time and has remained disputed since. What was not disputed was what the audience had seen with their own eyes, in a lit hall in the presence of witnesses. A dead man had moved. The questions this raised were not small. If electricity could produce movement in dead muscle, could it produce more? Was life simply a state of organized electrical activity? Could the line between living and dead be crossed, and crossed back? These were not fringe questions. These were the questions serious scientists were seriously asking. Percy and Byron discussed them in the lamplight while the rain came down outside, while the lake was invisible beyond the windows. while the cold of a summer that had forgotten to be summer sat in the walls of the villa. They had been at this for some evenings, and then, on a night in mid-June, in the firelit room, with the shutters against the weather and the candles low, Byron made a suggestion. They should each write a ghost story. It was a casual proposal, a way to fill the evenings, a game for people who are bored with ordinary games. Byron said it the way Byron said things, as though it had just occurred to him, as though the stakes were low. Percy agreed immediately. Polidori agreed. Claire, who was not in the room at the moment, or was in the room and was not consulted, was implicitly included. Mary said very little. She was thinking. The stakes, it turned out, were not low. The days that followed Byron's proposal were not, for most of the group, particularly productive. Byron wrote something. He began a story about a vampire, a nobleman, predatory and aristocratic, with features that bore a suspicious resemblance to his own. He wrote a few pages, decided it was not interesting enough to continue, and set it aside. Percy began something philosophical and lost interest in it. Polidori, who had the most to prove, struggled visibly. He eventually produced a piece about a woman whose head was replaced with a skull, which the group reviewed with the diplomatic restraint that the situation required, which is to say, they did not say very much. Meanwhile, Mary had nothing. This is the thing that tends to be smoothed over in the romantic retelling of this story. The famous author did not arrive at the famous novel in a single glorious flash. She spent days with nothing. Byron had proposed the challenge. Percy and Polidori had written, and Mary Godwin, the youngest person in the house, the only woman, the one who had spent her life in rooms full of famous people who did not quite include her, sat and had no idea what to write. Percy asked her. The accounts differ on exactly how he phrased it, but the question was essentially the same each time. The question was whether she had thought of a story yet. It was well-intentioned. It was also, in the context of a house containing Byron and Percy Shelley, the kind of question that lands differently on an 18-year-old girl than it was perhaps intended to. She had thought of nothing. Day after day she had thought of nothing. The blank that preceded the story of Frankenstein is not a well-known blank, but it was real, and it lasted, and it sat in her chest with the particular weight of creative failure in a room full of people who were not failing. This is worth dwelling on because the myth of the creative genius tends to compress this part. The blank. The days of nothing. The experience of being the youngest and least celebrated person in the room, and also the person who had not yet produced anything. The myth says the idea came. The truth says it came after days of not coming, after the visible failure of not having it when everyone else apparently did. She listened to the conversations. She thought. She went back to what she knew, which was the question she'd been living inside for 18 years without knowing it. The question of creation. The question of what happens after. The question that nobody in the room with her had actually experienced in the way she had, which was not as a philosophical position, but as the simple physical fact of her life. The evening that preceded the dream is described in Mary's own later account with a kind of reconstructed precision. The precision of someone who has gone back over the sequence many times and established where each element came from. Percy and Byron talked. The conversation moved, as it had moved several times before, to Galvanism and the question of reanimation. Someone mentioned the philosopher Erasmus Darwin, who had reportedly preserved a piece of vermicelli in a glass case until it began to move of its own accord, a story that was probably apocryphal, but that circulated in the period as an example of the boundary between the organic and the inorganic, the living and the merely preserved. The conversation went on. Mary listened. At some point she went to bed. She lay in the dark. The shutters were closed against the rain. The moonlight, what there was of it, filtering through the Tambora-thinned sky, struggled to get through the gaps. The room was cold, the kind of cold that had no reason to be present in June, a cold that belonged to October and had arrived months early and refused to apologize for it. She could not sleep. What happened next, Mary described herself. In the preface she wrote for the 1831 edition of Frankenstein, the only time she gave the full public account of the night, she wrote that her imagination, unbidden and guided by something she could not explain, became possessed. That she closed her eyes and had what she called a waking dream, though the word dream does not quite capture it. The vision had the quality of real sight, sharp and specific, not the soft blur of sleep, but something with edges and texture and weight. She saw a pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. She saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, showing signs of life, stirring with an uneasy, half-vital motion. The creature's eyes opened, yellow, watery, looking at the person who had made it. She saw the creator's terror in that moment. The student rushing away, hoping the spark would fade, that the thing would simply go back to being what it had been before. She saw the wish that it had never happened. She saw what it felt like to have made something and then been unable to look at it. She opened her own eyes. It was somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning. The room was dark. The rain was still on the shutters. The cold of the wrong season night was in the walls. And she understood, with a clarity that she later said was unlike anything she had experienced before, that she had found it. What terrified her would terrify others. She did not need to invent a ghost. She had seen one. She began writing the next morning, not from the beginning, that would come later, with Percy's encouragement and a structure that grew around the original scene. She began with the scene itself, the laboratory, the creature, the creator's moment of realization, the thing stirring on the table. It was, ultimately, the scene that became Chapter 5 of the published novel, the chapter that begins, "It was on a dreary night of November." The November that Victor Frankenstein describes in the novel's world was shaped by the June Mary experienced. The wrong season cold, the rain, the shutters, the moonlight struggling through. The Tambora sky that had made June feel like November provided, without knowing it was doing so, the atmosphere for the most famous moment in the history of science fiction. Percy read what she'd written and told her it was not a short story. It was a novel. He encouraged her, which is to say he did what Percy Shelley always did. He pushed her toward the larger and more ambitious version of the thing, because he recognized it immediately. He also contributed practically, in ways that have sometimes been overstated and sometimes undercounted. He helped structure the early chapters. He wrote the preface for the first published edition. He made suggestions that she sometimes accepted and sometimes did not. Here is what nobody tells about the making of Frankenstein, or what gets collapsed into a single sentence when it is told. Mary was 18 when she had the vision. She was 19 when the novel was completed. She wrote it in rented rooms, while managing a household on uncertain funds, while nursing a baby, while dealing with the ongoing social and legal chaos of her life with Percy. She was not writing in a studio with a fellowship and a quiet study. She was writing in the margins of a life that had very few margins, and she finished it. Whatever Percy's faults, and they were real, and this story has not minimized them, His eye for Mary's work was accurate. He knew what she had. He encouraged her to build it. She built it. In that same summer, in those same rented rooms, a parallel story was also assembling itself. Polidori had not been able to finish his skull piece, but he had taken Byron's abandoned vampire fragment, the few pages Byron had written and set aside, and begun to expand it into something coherent. The result, published in 1819 under the title The Vampire, became the first modern vampire narrative. Its protagonist, Lord Ruthven, was modelled unmistakably on Byron, aristocratic, magnetic, predatory, impossible to refuse and dangerous to trust. The resemblance was so obvious that Byron's name was attached to it at publication, either by a publisher who assumed it was his work or by a marketing decision that knew his name would sell copies. Byron was furious. He wrote a denial. The misattribution stuck in the public mind for some time anyway. Polidori's authorship was eventually recognised, though not with the enthusiasm that the recognition warranted. Polidori died in 1821 at 25 of what was ruled an accidental overdose of prussic acid. He was the youngest person in the Villa Diodati that summer. He was also, in some ways, the least well served by it. From that single wet summer, from those few weeks of rain and constraint and brilliant, difficult conversation, the monster that asks why it was made, and the vampire that cannot die. The two founding archetypes of modern horror, produced simultaneously in rooms within walking distance of each other by people who were barely on speaking terms by the end of June. Neither work was initially credited to its actual author. Both changed the shape of what stories were allowed to be. The person who got the least credit and lived the shortest life was Polidori. The person who got the most credit and lived the longest legacy was Mary Godwin, who had spent the days before her idea arrived having absolutely nothing in a house full of people who did not know how to wait. There is something in that if a person stops to hold it for a moment. The man at the centre of all of this, Percy Bysshe Shelley, 23, full of ideas, never not talking, the person who had pushed Mary toward the bigger version of the story, was, by the summer of 1816, the thing she most relied on in the world. He was unreliable and financially disastrous and morally complicated and completely, genuinely certain that she was extraordinary. He carried that certainty the way he carried everything, at the front, openly, without reservation. She knew what she had in him. She also knew what she did not have in him, which was stability, or safety, or anything that resembled a conventional life. She did not know that summer in Geneva that she was already carrying the most important thing she would ever carry from him. Not the novel, though the novel was extraordinary, something smaller, something that would sit in a drawer for 29 years, wrapped in a silk cloth, inside the pages of a poem. But the summer was not finished. The notebook was open. The story was growing. And the autumn was coming, and with it, something that would break the year in two. They left Geneva in late August 1816, and came back to England with a novel half written in a notebook. The journey home was less eventful than the journey out. No rough channel crossing. No philosophical arguments about freedom and the open sea. No borrowed donkeys. Just the reverse of the outward route. Holland, the English coast, the grey familiar sky of a country that had also had a bad summer and was not particularly glad to see them. They settled in Bath, which Percy had chosen partly for reasons of distance from London's creditors, and partly because Claire needed somewhere quiet and relatively anonymous. Claire was visibly pregnant by now. Byron was in Switzerland and had communicated through various channels that he would not be returning to England in the near future and possibly ever. The subject of Claire's condition was managed by the household with the practiced efficiency of people who had extensive experience managing subjects that the world preferred not to examine directly. Mary wrote, "This needs to be said plainly, because it is easy to lose in the surrounding noise of the period. In the autumn of 1816, while living in rented rooms in Bath with her stepsister's illegitimate pregnancy, and Percy's ongoing financial emergency, and her own grief still present from the baby she had lost 18 months earlier, Mary Godwin was writing a novel about a man who made a creature and could not face what he had made. She was writing it with the diligence of someone who understood that the story had a shape, and the shape had to be maintained, regardless of what was happening on the other side of the writing desk. She worked every day. The notebook accumulated. The autumn, however, was not interested in her schedule. On October 9th, 1816, Fanny Imlay was found dead in a hotel room in Swansea. She had been in London in the weeks before her death, moving between addresses, and the picture that emerges from the fragmentary correspondence of the period is of a woman who'd been quietly unravelling for some time without anyone in the household noticing the degree to which this was so. She had written to Mary and to Godwin. The letters were unremarkable on their surface. The letters of someone who was managing, who was keeping up, who had not yet said the thing they were actually trying to say. She'd been considering whether to go to Ireland, where Wollstonecraft's relatives lived, to find some form of independent life away from the Godwin household. Nothing came of it. She left for Swansea instead, alone, in early October. She checked into a hotel under a false name. She had taken an overdose of laudanum. She was 22 years old. The letter she left behind, partial enough to establish what had happened, was unsigned, which was not an accident. She knew or understood that a signed suicide note would create a scandal for the Godwin family that her father could not survive. Even in the act of ending her life, Fanny Imlay was managing the household, protecting the people who had leaned on her without quite knowing it, ensuring that her disappearance from the world caused as little disruption as possible. This is the detail that stops a reader cold if they let it. She did not sign the letter, even then. Godwin's response was, characteristically, to suppress the story. He asked that the inquest be kept quiet. He did not attend the funeral. He instructed that the cause of death should not be widely discussed. He wrote to his wife that it would be best if nobody knew. Fanny was buried in Swansea under an unmarked grave. Her name was not publicly connected to the death for years. Godwin had spent his career arguing for radical transparency in human affairs and the abolition of hypocrisy as a social institution. He was, by all accounts, not conscious of any inconsistency here, Mary was told. She grieved quietly, in the way she had learned to grieve, not stopping, not collapsing, writing. There is no evidence that she blamed herself. There is evidence that she understood, without requiring it to be spelled out, what Fanny's life had been. The quiet girl, the load-bearing wall, the person who was always simply there until the morning she was not, the person who managed things so efficiently that nobody had managed to notice she was not managing herself. 6 weeks passed. The novel continued. 6 weeks later, the second letter came. Harriet Shelley, the woman this account promised to return to, back in the autumn of 1814, when she was still alive in a rented room with 2 small children and a husband who had moved on, was found in the Serpentine, a lake in Hyde Park, on December the 10th, 1816. She was 21 years old, She'd been living under the name Harriet Smith. She was pregnant at the time of her death by someone who was not Percy Shelley. A detail the historical record notes without judgment, and this account will do the same. She had been living away from her family, in circumstances that the records describe only obliquely. The coroner returned a verdict of found drowned. The news arrived in Bath on a December afternoon. The room, according to later accounts, was cold, the kind of cold that bathhouses held in winter when the fireplaces were drawing poorly and the damp had worked its way into the plaster. Mary had been writing. The pen was still on the desk. There is no record of what was said, or whether anyone was writing when the letter arrived and stopped mid-sentence. There is a record of what happened next, which is that Percy began making legal arrangements. This is not a criticism. It is simply what happened next. Here is the thing about Harriet Shelley that the usual telling of this story does not quite give her. She was not a villain in it. She was not a fool. She was not a cautionary tale or a narrative device. She was a girl of 16 who had believed a brilliant young man when he told her she was too good for ordinary life, who had acted on that belief, and who'd been left to navigate the consequences when the brilliant young man moved on to someone he found more interesting. She had not done anything wrong. She had simply been 19 in 1814, in an England that offered women in her position almost no legal recourse and no social shelter. The custody proceedings that followed her death were swift and brutal in a way that illuminated Percy's philosophical convictions from an unexpected angle. He had spent years arguing that conventional morality was a cage. The Lord Chancellor, ruling on his application for custody of Yancey and Charles, agreed that Percy had indeed lived outside conventional morality and ruled accordingly. Atheism, publicly declared. Cohabitation with a woman not his wife, publicly conducted. The cage, it turned out, also contained the children. The hearing itself lasted less than a day. The ruling cited Percy's published writings. His early pamphlet, The Necessity of Atheism, which had got him expelled from Oxford in 1811, was read into the record. Ianthe and Charles were placed in the care of a clergyman and his wife chosen by the court. Percy never had custody of them. He rarely saw them afterward, and the historical record is not generous on the question of how hard he tried. The romantic conviction that the rules were for smaller people had legal consequences that Percy Shelley spent the rest of his life not thinking about very much, which was itself a kind of privilege. 20 days after Harriet's body was pulled from the Serpentine, on December the 30th, 1816, Mary Godwin and Percy Bysshe Shelley were married at St Mildred's Church in London. The witnesses were William Godwin and Mary Jane Claremont, Mary's father and stepmother, the people who'd refused to speak to her for 2.5 years. Godwin had reconciled with Percy in November. The reconciliation was warm. It was also prompt. Percy's financial prospects had recently improved, and Godwin had debts that Percy could help address. The timing of this reconciliation was noted by people who observed it at the time, and has been noted by biographers ever since, and this account will simply add its note to the record and move on. The marriage made Mary's situation safer. It gave her legal standing. It regularized an arrangement that society had been holding against her for 2 years. Whether it was also an act of love is not a question the historical record settles, and this account will not pretend to settle it either. What it was, undeniably, was a ceremony that took place 20 days after a woman's body was found in a lake, a woman whose death made the ceremony possible in a legal sense. And that fact sat in the air of the small London church, between the vows and the witnesses, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Mary wrote in her journal on the day of the wedding. She noted it briefly. Then she noted that she would continue the novel. She was 19 years old. She had, in the preceding 10 weeks, lost her half-sister to suicide, received the news of her partner's first wife's drowning, married that partner in a ceremony attended by her estranged father, and been writing throughout all of it a novel about a creator who abandoned what he made and a creature that could not understand why. This is the fact that is hardest to hold and most important to hold. She did not stop. Other people, reasonable people, people with far less cause to stop, she did not. The notebook that left Geneva with half a novel in it left London in January with something closer to 3/4. She was moving toward a finished manuscript with the consistency of someone who decided, at some point she probably could not identify, that finishing the novel was non-negotiable. Not because anyone was waiting for it, not because she had a contract or a deadline, because the story had a shape, and she was the only person who knew what that shape was, and letting it go unfinished would have been a different kind of loss from the ones she had already absorbed, and she had already absorbed enough. If the novel had not already been about everything that mattered to her, the autumn of 1816 would have written it for her from scratch. The creature in Frankenstein, at the end of the novel's long middle section, confronts Victor Frankenstein on the ice of a glacier and makes an argument. The argument is not about terror. It is about justice. It is about the fact that the creature did not ask to be made, did not choose the form it was given, did not consent to the terms of its existence. It asks why a creator who could not bear the sight of his creation brought that creation into being at all. The creature, in this confrontation, is not raving. It is not incoherent. It has taught itself to speak by listening to a family through the wall of a cottage. It has read Paradise Lost and Plutarch's Lives and the Sorrows of Young Werther, which it found in a bag in the forest, and has used them to develop a philosophical vocabulary precise enough to articulate its grievance with clarity. It says, in the novel, I, the miserable and the abandoned, am an abortion, to be spurned at and kicked and trampled on. The word abortion here is used in the 19th century sense of something brought to a premature end before its proper development, a failed creation, a thing that arrived wrong. It is not a figure of speech for Mary. It is the exact word for the dead baby she held in February 1815, the baby who stirred in the dream and did not stir in the room. It is the most coherent speech in the novel because it is the most personally inhabited. Scholars who have traced the novel's emotional sources have consistently pointed to this passage as the one that reads least like literary construction and most like testimony. Whether Mary consciously drew on her own experience of being an unwanted consequence of someone else's act, or whether it surfaced through the writing without being directed, the result is the same. A voice in the novel that does not sound like invention. She was 20 years old when she finished writing it. That this novel was published is not a given. That it survived the winter of 1816 and the chaos of the year that followed is not a given. That it reached a publisher, and that publisher accepted it, and it appeared in print in January 1818, under the title Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, with Percy's name initially more visible than Mary's, is the product of effort and stubbornness and the refusal to let the story go unfinished, even when the autumn was providing reasons one after another to let everything go. The manuscript was submitted to 3 publishers before Lackington. Hughes, Harding, Maver and Jones accepted it. The first 2 said no. The reasons were not recorded in detail. The third said yes, on condition that the novel be published in 3 volumes, the standard commercial format of the period, which padded a story out and raised the price and made it more suitable for the circulating libraries that were the primary distribution mechanism for fiction in 1818. Mary expanded the manuscript accordingly. The published Frankenstein is longer than the original draft, and the additional material was added under conditions of active domestic chaos, while the household was preparing to leave England for the continent. She was revising a novel about a creator building something under impossible circumstances, while being a creator building something under impossible circumstances. She does not appear to have found this ironic, or if she did not record it. She did not let it go. The novel was published. The world read it. And for many years after, it assumed the author was Percy Shelley. Frankenstein was published anonymously in January 1818. The dedication was to William Godwin. The preface was written by Percy Shelley. The reviews assumed Percy had written the novel. Some reviewers praised it with the specific enthusiasm that critics reserve for work that frightens them a little. Others were disturbed by it in ways they struggled to articulate. The Edinburgh Magazine called it a bold and original fiction. The Quarterly Review found it offensive in the way that it applied scientific speculation to the question of human creation, which was felt to be a subject that should not be approached in that particular spirit. The reviewers who suspected a female author did not, as a rule, believe this improved their opinion of the book. One review noted that the novel showed an unusual degree of ability for a woman's production, which was the period's way of saying that was good, followed immediately by the reminder that the bar for women was lower and had therefore been more impressively cleared. Mary let the reviews arrive and continued writing. Sir Walter Scott, reviewing the novel in Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, attributed it to Percy. He praised it with genuine enthusiasm, calling it a work of great power and scientific knowledge, and addressed his praise entirely to the wrong person. Mary wrote to him. She wrote, in a letter that has survived, that she was the author of Frankenstein. The letter is polite. It is also precise. She did not hedge. She did not suggest Percy had helped significantly. She said she wrote it. Scott acknowledged the correction. He did not revise his review. Percy was alive. For 4 more years Percy was alive, and the life they lived together was still the life it had always been. Financially chaotic, geographically unstable, full of brilliant conversation and intermittent disaster. They had more children. Clara died in infancy in 1818. William, the boy named for Godwin, the healthy baby of January 1816, died of malaria in Rome in 1819 at 3 years old. Percy Florence, born November 1819, survived. He was the only one of their children who did. Between the deaths and the moves and Percy's ongoing legal, financial and personal entanglements, Mary wrote. She wrote Mathilda, a short novel about a father's destructive and obsessive love for his daughter, which was so personally close to her situation with Godwin that Percy advised against publishing it, and she did not. It was not published until 1959, 140 years after she finished it. She wrote Valperga, a historical novel. She kept the journal. She wrote letters. She was always writing. Clara's death was in Venice in September 1818. The baby, their second daughter, born the previous January, had developed an illness during the journey south, and the journey itself, undertaken in September heat across difficult roads, had made it worse. They reached Venice too late to do anything useful. Clara was buried there. She was 1 year and 1 month old. Mary wrote about it in a letter to a friend. The letter is, in the way of her grief letters, specific about facts and controlled about feeling. She was 20 years old. William's death was in Rome in June 1819. He was 3 years old. He died of malaria in the city that Mary had once found beautiful. The speed with which the disease moved through a child's body in that period, before anyone understood what malaria was or how it worked, meant there was almost no time between the alarm and the outcome. William Shelley is buried in the Protestant cemetery in Rome near the Pyramid of Cestius. The grave is still there. After William died, Mary entered a period of sustained depression that the journals record without softening. She stopped writing with the regularity she had maintained through every other catastrophe. For several months she was simply not writing. This is worth noting because it was the only time in the record when the writing stopped. Everything else she had absorbed and continued. William was different. She had been healthy when he was born. She had named him for her father. He had been the one who survived when the others had not. Percy wrote, "He produced in these 4 years some of the finest poetry in the English language. Prometheus Unbound, Ode to the West Wind, To a Skylark, Adonis, The Triumph of Life." He was not famous. He was not widely read. He was known in a small circle and regarded by that circle as extraordinary. But the reading public had not caught up with him. He knew this. He continued anyway, which was, whatever else one might say about Percy Bysshe Shelley, a form of integrity. In the summer of 1822 they were living at Casa Magni, a house on the Gulf of Spezia in Italy, on the water. The house was damp and beautiful and difficult to reach by land, which suited Percy. He had a boat, a small fast schooner about 22 feet long, designed by a naval architect in Genoa, and not, apparently, designed with particular attention to the weather conditions of the Ligurian coast in summer. He called it the Don Juan, and he used it to sail up and down the Gulf to visit Byron, who was further along the coast, and to cross to Livorno, where their friend Leigh Hunt had arrived from England with his family. On July 8, 1822, Percy sailed to Livorno with his friend Edward Williams to meet Hunt. The meeting happened, the return journey did not. A storm came up in the afternoon. Witnesses on the shore reported seeing the boat in difficulty. By evening it was clear that it had not made port. By nightfall, nothing had returned. Percy Bysshe Shelley was 29 years old. The bodies washed ashore over the following days. Mary was at Casa Magni when the news came. There is an account, partially reconstructed, partially from letters, of the waiting. 3 days at the window of the house on the water, watching for a sail that did not appear. The house sat directly on the sea, the terrace only feet from the water when the tide was in, and the sound of the Gulf of Spezia was constant. The slap of small waves on stone, the creak of the building's foundations in the wind. Mary and Jane Williams, whose husband Edward had also been on the boat, waited together. They had been told the boat was overdue. They had not yet been told what overdue meant. The distinction between not knowing and knowing is a specific kind of suffering, and it lasted 3 days. In clear conditions, a boat at distance in the Gulf of Spezia was visible from the Casa Magni terrace. In the days after July 8th, 1822, the weather cleared. There was nothing to see. At some point the word came, through a letter, through someone who'd heard from Livorno, through the specific social mechanics of bad news finding its way to the person who most needed not to receive it. Mary was 24. She had been through Fanny. She had been through Harriet. She had been through the baby who had not survived. What she had not been through was losing Percy, who had been the fixed point, the chaotic but constant centre, the person who had always come back from wherever he had gone. The bodies were brought ashore and burned on the beach, on August 15th at Viareggio and August 16th at the Gulf of Spezia. The burning on the beach is one of the most theatrical scenes in English literary history, and it is theatrical in a way that the people present seem to understand was happening even while it happened. Byron was present. Edward Trelawney, the adventurer and memoirist who had attached himself to the Shelley circle, was present and later wrote about it at considerable length, twice in different memoirs, with details that evolve between the two accounts in the way that details sometimes do when someone knows the story has weight. They had wine, they had incense, they threw frankincense and salt onto the fire. The flames turned colours that Trelawney attributed to the chemicals in the sea-soaked wood, greens and blues at the edges that he described as beautiful, and that the others present also described as beautiful, which tells something about the intersection of grief and spectacle in the romantic imagination. Byron at some point could not bear it and swam out to his yacht. He was not a man who handled grief by staying near it. Trelawney stayed. He had appointed himself the custodian of this moment, and he intended to fulfil the role completely. Trelawney reached into the fire and pulled out Percy's heart. This is not a metaphor. Percy's heart had been preserved partially by the salt and the seawater that had saturated the body. It did not fully combust in the fire. Trelawney removed it with his bare hands from the flames and kept it. Mary asked for it. Trelawney gave it to Hunt first, and there was a dispute, and the dispute took some time to resolve, and at the end of it Mary had what remained of Percy's heart, wrapped in silk. She kept it for the rest of her life. When she died, 29 years later, it was found in her desk, inside the pages of his poem Adonais. The silk had dried around it. The pages had closed over it. The manuscript had been folded to contain it. She had apparently put it there and never taken it out again. This is the silk cloth this story mentioned in October 1816, when it said that what Percy would leave her was not the novel, though the novel was extraordinary. Something smaller, something that would sit in a drawer for 29 years, wrapped in a silk cloth, inside the pages of a poem. Now we are here. The question of what Mary Shelley did next, after the fire on the beach, after the dispute over the heart, after the return to England with Percy Florence, and no money and no income, and a reputation that was controversial, and a novel that had been published anonymously 5 years earlier, is a question that the story of Frankenstein tends not to spend very long on, because Frankenstein is finished, and Percy is dead, and the dramatic arc, by conventional storytelling logic, has resolved. It had not resolved for her. The return to England from Italy in 1823 was, logistically, a more orderly journey than the original departure to France in 1814 had been. There was no borrowed donkey. There was a proper carriage, and Percy Florence was nearly 4 years old and could be managed in a way that an infant could not. But the distance between the two journeys, the girl of 16 crossing the channel in the dark with everything ahead of her, and the woman of 25 crossing it again with a child and his dead husband's unpublished manuscripts in a trunk, is a distance that the biographical record does not fully close. She had been gone 9 years. The city that received her was the same city she had left, which is never actually true, but which is how cities feel when the person who has changed is you. She came back to England in 1823. She was 25. She spent the next 30 years editing Percy's poetry and letters and unpublished work, writing her own novels, supporting herself and her son by writing at a pace and volume that was, given the circumstances, remarkable. There was the complicated relationship with Sir Timothy Shelley. Percy's father, who had cut Percy off during his lifetime and now controlled the family money that Percy Florence would eventually inherit. Sir Timothy's terms were specific. He would provide an allowance for Percy Florence on condition that no biography of Percy was published while Sir Timothy was alive. He lived until 1844. Mary spent 21 years not writing the biography she had the material, the knowledge, and arguably the moral authority to write. She wrote other things instead: Lodore, Faulkner, The Last Man, a novel set in a future where plague has killed nearly everyone, narrated by the final surviving human. The Last Man is worth pausing on, because it is the novel of Mary Shelley's later career that has accumulated the most serious critical attention in recent decades, and because it is, in ways that were not apparent when it appeared in 1826, a novel deeply shaped by the Tambora decade. Its world is one in which the systems that sustain human life have simply stopped working. The harvests are gone. The populations that agriculture had built are dying. The narrator moves through a landscape of accumulating loss and documents it with the diligence of someone who knows that nobody else will. Literary scholars have argued with some consistency that The Last Man is Mary's most complete working out of what she had begun to understand in 1816, that catastrophe comes from outside the frame of normal expectation, that the scale of what can go wrong is larger than the structures people build to manage it, and that the right response to the evidence of this is to keep writing. The novel was not widely read when it appeared. It is more widely read now, which is possibly the shape that truth takes when it arrives too early. She did all of this without Percy's certainty, without the person who had been completely, genuinely and specifically certain that she was extraordinary. He had carried that certainty at the front, openly, without reservation or condition. She had known what she had in him. Without him, she was the person who had to know it herself. This is a different and harder thing than being told. It requires, daily, the decision to continue believing it without external confirmation. She continued believing it. The evidence is the work. She never remarried. She had offers. She declined them, politely and with finality. She had a close friendship in later life with a man named Aubrey Beauclerk, warm enough that some biographers have read more into it. The historical record does not settle the question. She focused on Percy Florence, who became, as adults sometimes do when raised by extraordinary people in difficult circumstances, a kind and somewhat conventional man. She focused on the work. She's usually described, in the biographies and encyclopedia entries that have accumulated around her, as Percy Shelley's wife. The more accurate description is the woman who kept his work alive while writing her own. The edition she prepared, annotated, carefully ordered, with biographical notes that placed his poems in the context of his life and thought, were central to establishing his reputation in the decades after his death. She built the monument. She built it from the inside at close range, knowing better than anyone what the work had cost and what it was worth, and knowing also that the monument would, for a long time, stand where she herself was standing, which is the particular irony of being the person who makes something famous that obscures the person who made it famous. Mary Shelley died on February 1st, 1851, at the age of 53. The cause was a brain tumour, most likely a meningioma, a slow-growing mass that had been pressing on the tissue for some time before the end, causing headaches and weakness in her limbs and episodes of paralysis that the physicians of the period could identify but not treat. She had been declining for several years. Percy Florence was with her. She was at her home in Chester Square, London, in a room that looked out toward a garden that was not visible from the bed by the time she was too ill to sit up. She had not finished the biography of Percy. She had not been permitted to, and then she had lost the energy for it, and then she had lost the time. She was buried at St. Peter's Church in Bournemouth, where Percy Florence lived. Her parents were there already, or rather, William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft were there, because Percy Florence had arranged for them to be moved from their graves in St. Pancras churchyard in London, where Mary had learned to read her mother's name from the stone, where she had carried books and notebooks and eventually a young poet who wanted to talk to a dead philosopher. Percy Florence disinterred his grandparents and reburied them beside their daughter. Mary Wollstonecraft, who'd never met her daughter, was buried next to her 53 years later. Percy's heart was in the grave. The desk was emptied, the silk cloth and the poem found inside it, and whatever else remained was arranged according to Percy Florence's judgment about what his mother would have wanted. The historical record is not detailed on the precise disposition of the heart, but the most consistent account places it with her. She was buried with what she had kept. The 1831 edition of Frankenstein, the revised edition, published 13 years after the first, carried a new preface. Mary wrote it herself. It was the first time she publicly claimed the novel, the first time her name and the book appeared together in the same document, with authorship made explicit rather than implied or denied. The 1831 edition was not simply a reprint with a new preface. Mary revised the text substantially. She softened some of the more radical elements of the original, passages that had argued, with early 19th century directness, against conventional religion and the structures of society. She gave Victor Frankenstein a less ambiguous moral arc, making his fall clearer and his culpability less debatable. She removed some of the passages that scholars have since identified as most likely Percy's contributions to the original draft, places where the prose becomes more ecstatic and less precise, more concerned with abstract beauty than with physical consequence. The 1831 Frankenstein is a slightly more conventional novel than the 1818 one. It is also the version almost everyone has read, because it was the version that stayed in print while the original went out and did not return for over a century. When people say Frankenstein, they almost always mean the 1831 edition. The original text, restored by scholars in the 20th century, is a rawer document, closer to the notebooks, closer to the January weather of 1818, closer to the 18-year-old who had not yet decided how much the world needed to be protected from what she knew. In the preface, she described the summer of 1816, the Villa Diodati, Byron's challenge, the nights of ghost stories. She described waking at 2 a.m. with the pale student in her mind. She described beginning to write the next morning. She wrote it with the clarity and compression of someone who had rehearsed the account many times in private, and knew exactly how much to give. She did not describe the dead baby. She did not describe Fanny. She did not describe Harriet or the winter of 1814, or the 7 years of loss that had been composing the novel long before she put a word on paper. She gave the story in its presentable form, the creative exercise, the brilliant evening, the inspired young woman. The private version, the art that makes the novel what it actually is, stayed private until the biographers came. It has not stayed private since. Frankenstein has never been out of print. In over 200 years, since the 3 anonymous volumes appeared in January 1818, it has not once gone out of print. It has been translated into every major language. It has been adapted for film more than any other novel in the English language. The number of cinematic adaptations exceeds 250, which is a figure that continues to increase. Boris Karloff, Kenneth Branagh, Benedict Cumberbatch, animated versions for children, horror films in which the monster does not speak and does not ask why it was made, which is the exact reversal of what the novel is about. This is the irony the story has carried since 1818. The creature in the book is articulate, philosophical, grief-stricken and morally complex. The creature in the cultural imagination is a bolt-necked, shambling figure who grunts and frightens people. The name Frankenstein, which belongs to the creator in the novel and not the creature, is almost universally applied to the creature instead. The argument the novel makes, that the horror lies not in the monster but in the creator's failure to take responsibility for what was made, is almost universally reversed by the adaptations, which make the horror the monster itself. The creature in the novel is never named. This is not an oversight. Victor Frankenstein never names it, which is itself the first of many abandonments. The creature arrives in the world as a fully adult being with no childhood, no name, no context for what it is, and a creator who took one look at it and ran. It then educates itself, as previously noted, through a combination of eavesdropping and reading. It becomes, over the course of the novel's middle section, more articulate and more philosophically sophisticated than the narrator telling its story. The most lucid mind in Frankenstein is the mind of the being that everyone else in the novel treats as a monster. This is not a subtle argument. Mary Godwin made it at 19 and it's been slightly too on the nose for some readers ever since, which is a compliment she would have accepted. This is not entirely the fault of the adaptations. The novel is genuinely frightening. But it is frightening in the way that an argument is frightening because it is correct, and because the thing it is correct about is something most people would prefer not to think about. Mary Godwin knew from biography, if not from philosophy, the weight of questions that Frankenstein asks. She had grown up inside them. The dead mother, the living father who could not face what he had made, the dead baby who stirred in the dream and did not stir in the room, the warm hands rubbing a cold body by a fire and the warmth that did not work. She was 4 years old then. She was sitting in the grass between the headstones, in the afternoon light, running her finger along the letters of the name that was also hers. The stone was cold. The grass smelled of a London in summer, stone dust and cut grass and the distant press of the city beyond the churchyard wall. She could read. She was tracing the letters because she could, because the name was hers, because the woman underneath it was the closest she would ever get to her mother. We said, at the start of this story, that we would return to that grave, that it was where something began, that by the end the grave would be something different from what it was at the beginning. Here is what it is, at the end. It is the beginning of the argument. The argument that Frankenstein makes. The argument that a creation has the right to ask its creator why. The argument that the gap between making something and facing what has been made is not a philosophical abstraction, but a specific weight that falls on a specific person. The person made, not the person who made them. The grave in St Pancras churchyard is where Mary Shelley first sat inside that argument, at 4 years old, in the summer grass, running her finger along the letters of a name. The book that came out of that argument is still here. 206 years and counting. That girl became the woman who wrote it. Frankenstein is not a horror novel, or it is, but only incidentally. It is a novel about what happens when creation is not followed by responsibility, about the child who is abandoned by the act that made it, and who asks with clarity and grief, why? Mary Shelley wrote it at 18 and 19 in rented rooms through 3 deaths and a marriage and a winter made cold by a mountain in Indonesia that had exploded 14 months earlier. She published it at 20. She named it for Prometheus, the titan who gave humans fire and then watched in chains as it burned. The fire has not gone out. Frankenstein was in print when Mary Shelley died in 1851. It was in print when the 20th century began, when cinema found it, when every new technology produced a new question about what happens when humans make something they do not fully understand. It is in print now. It will be in print when the question it asks, what do we owe to the things we create, is answered, if it ever is. We will come back. Good night,